Good evening and welcome to the Dark Ozarks.
Hello, everybody. Hello, Lisa.
Hey, Josh. Hello, everyone. Hope everyone's having a great evening.
Absolutely. We thank everybody for joining us and joining us just in this continuing pilgrimage of research and investigative processes into the culture and history of the Ozarks, particularly with an emphasis on the noir, the weird, and the paranormal, which is an extraordinary amount of fun.
Yes.
And it's exciting that so many people have joined us in that process.
Yes, I mean, and made it a community. I mean, very humbling.
It really, really is. And of course, as part of that community, our autumn season is about to kick off, in which you all can join us in person and get to visit in person at a wide variety of locations across the Ozarks, beginning this Saturday, September 17th, 10 a.m. to 6 p.m. at Hollister, Missouri, at the State of the Ozarks Fest.
Yes, and I think you have a visual effect.
I do. For those following on the video cast, we just happen to have a poster here. Just happened to.
This happened. And it's a great event. It really is.
It is. Of course, if you are just listening on the Branson Podcast Network, on SoundCloud, etc., and if you are in the Branson area, the White River country, you should be seeing a lot of these posters and flyers out and about, several thousand of them to be specific.
Good.
And we're really looking forward to it. This is State of the Ozarks' largest annual event. It is the 6th year of the festival. It is, of course, my 6th year. I'm the event creator. It is your 6th year. You've been down for every single event.
Yep.
And lots and lots of fun. Of course, the roster of entertainment and vendors is published on stateoftheozarks.net. You can check that out. That went online. Finalized public version went online just on Sunday. And we've got great sponsors. We've got great food. It is a beautiful historic location. And right at the moment, weather looks really, really positive. Mid-80s and sunny.
It's going to be great, and Dark Ozarks is going to be there. So
yes. Our books will be there. We will be there along with our books. My box of books showed up in the mail a couple of days ago.
Mine too.
It's what happens when you order them ahead of time. Who knew? Did not realize how that worked. You order things in advance, and it shows up. Who knew? This has escaped me so many times before, but here we are, and we'll be. It's a great event. Order of the Red Boar will be fighting in traditional 15th century medieval combat between at noon and at 5 in the current schedule. And they also want you to know they are mercenaries. There is no royalty amongst the Order of the Red Boar at present. They have, as far as I know, they've not accepted anyone of that nature. They've always been mercenaries. They are available for hire, and
They have not pledged to a liege, huh?
No, they have remained delightfully unencumbered.
Even better.
They are consistently unreformed.
That's great. No, it really is a good event. 10 to 6, free to the public, and come on down. We'd love to see you.
We are looking forward to it.
Then the following Saturday, watch what you're doing. The following Saturday, we will be in Caney, Kansas, for the SCK Bordertown Paracon.
Yes, excited to get there. I've never been into the Little Ozarks, as they're oftentimes called, a section of Kansas that is actually new to me. And to me, it's a huge honor. We're invited along with some other folks, and some great folks to be on the panels. And great event. You were there last year. I was not able to attend. We'll both be there this year. we just invite folks to come out and see what's going on. And I love the nuts and bolts on the ground aspect of things like paranormal investigation. And it's a neat aspect of our culture that many people might be surprised to find is, really a developing genre.
It really is. And anyone that's interested, if they go over to Facebook, to the SEK Bordertown Paranormal page, you can find details for the exact location and itinerary. And I know we're going to be on panels throughout the day, so it's going to be interesting. And then October 7th, we are back at Hollister.
Yes, back in my adopted hometown. Hollister First Friday Art Walk, hosted by State of the Ozarks. And Dark Ozarks is going to be having a haunted Hollister walking tour that night. We meet at the Old English Inn at 7:30 p.m. Tickets are available on paranormalsciencelive.com. And I'm very excited to be back for this event. It's going to be a 3-part event with a walking and history tour regarding Taney and the White River Hills. Then some of the anecdotal haunting reports of Downing Street itself. Traditional Ozarks storytelling at our 1909 Edwardian era railroad depot, which is beautiful, absolutely beautiful. And I was going to say beautifully restored, but I'm just going to say beautifully preserved. It has been taken care of very well since its opening, and continues to be well taken care of to this day. And then an extensive tour of the historic Old English Inn, as well as a survey investigation of paranormal activity.
Yes, that's going to be a lot of fun. And then on the 15th of October, we will be in Joplin at the VFW Post 534 for Dark Ozarks October Country, which is going to be a day-long event where we delve into everything under our umbrella of Dark Ozarks, from dark history to mysteries to paranormal related items.
A lot of activity. I will be arriving as the Ozarks Howler, in case anyone wonders, because why not? The Ozarks Howler is the bane of my existence, and I'm embracing my deeply traditional Anglo-Saxon roots and shamanic heritage by donning the pelt of my enemy. Some of each. There's a number of unpleasant things that haunt my existence, and the Ozark Howler is one of them. So who knows? Well, it would be interesting to see what happens in that regard. I do have an excellent flowchart prepared for the occasion.
I've seen it. He does.
I know. Yes, you have. Yes, you have. And it's quite impressive in its stylistic design. And then, in addition to that, something I'm impressed. We did just a initial survey of the VFW post in Joplin. There, to me, because the building itself, the current building, is comparatively modern. It's not.
Yes.
It's it's not.
There's been a lot of things that happen there in other buildings too. So.
Yes, and a lot of things that have happened in that building over, say, the past 40 or 50 years. And to me, it's a great example. We may dig into some of this theming a little bit later, a concept, but buildings that look modern or, are modern, comparatively speaking, that one doesn't visually associate with hauntings can have a lot of activity. And the VFW Hall is one of those locations.
It is. And it's just going to be a lot of fun, and we get you all involved, and we want your input over there, and we don't want to be talking heads. And there's going to be refreshments and food, so a great time.
Yeehaw. I saw some of the food that was coming out of the kitchen while we were doing the survey, and it looks really good. So I'm looking forward to getting back, and while I'm preparing my my extensive diagram on the Ozark Howler, I'm going to be snuggling up close next to a giant cheeseburger.
There you go. Can't beat that. And then, I guess let's do a shout out to here at this point, because not only for the podcast and video cast is Always Buying Books a sponsor, but they're sponsoring October Country. So Always Buying Books in Joplin, great resource for reading material, research, high-end collectible books, etc. Check them out in person or online at alwaysbuyingbooks.net, on Facebook, Always Buying Books, and their group friends who like Always Buying Books. And if you can't get by in person, you can order by phone, etc. So, and they will ship it to you.
Yes.
Or if you're Josh, you have me pick it up for you.
I was gonna say, or a great friend who just goes by and picks it up for you. So it's good all the way around. So excited to be able to work with Bob and Elise. Fantastic place, great curated collections. And if you're in the area, just make the place a regular stop. And if you are traveling on Route 66 or on I-44, make it a regular stop on your way through.
That's right. Let's see. And then after that, on October 20th, we will be back in Joplin.
Yes.
For the Old Joplin Downtown Walking Tour, which covers history of Old Joplin and ghost stories of the downtown area. It's being held in conjunction with Third Thursday Art Walk, which is put on by the Joplin Downtown Alliance. And we love working with them because they are do a lot of good work supporting the artisan community in the area, as well as being instrumental in a number of historic building restorations. So it's always good to work with them, and proceeds help benefit their efforts. So come on out. It's always a good one. And it's going to be the first time.
Yeah, I'm so excited about all of this. And then October 29th, we will be in Newtonia, Missouri at the Ritchie Mansion, the Community Center, and the Civil War Cemetery.
Yes. And I'm just excited and humbled that this event keeps getting bigger and bigger every time we do it. And proceeds help support preservation of the Ritchie Mansion. And we work in conjunction with the Valfield Preservation Society. And there's going to be food, there's going to be refreshments, there's going to be lots of history and storytelling, tours, and then a paranormal investigation demonstration. So it's well worth it.
It is. And I'm thrilled that I'm honored to get to come back, and love the fact that such a large percentage of the proceeds go to support the Ritchie Mansion for future generations. Plus, you had me food. I'm in.
Yes, that's true. And then November 19th, 2 to 4, we will be at Always Buying Books for a book signing our books. So come out, see us. Our books will be available for purchase, signing, etc. And it's going to be fun. And the bookstore's haunted.
Absolutely, can't get any more fun than that. I'm excited. In a future episode, coming up. I think we'll do a deep dive on our work, on our books, and lots of cool stuff. Now, for much of our audience, and I know this going in because I've already had this conversation with a number of people at events that go, "Is it fiction?" And I'm going, "Lisa's is nonfiction, mine is fiction," and they go, "I don't read fiction," and then they go over to your books. And I don't blame them for that. Your books are excellent. Highly recommend them.
Well, your book is excellent. It's awesome. Aside from the fact, good place to tell people if they are interested in your nonfiction, then they need to go read the articles at stateoftheozarks.net.
Very, very true. I write a lot of nonfiction on State of the Ozarks, and we're looking forward to doing a lot more of that on stateoftheozarks.net. As at the point that the event calendar slows down just a little bit, and we enter into the dark winter months.
Yes, we've got things planned. So.
Very, very cool. Excited about that. I'm excited to get into the Carnegie Library in Webb City. I have been briefly.
You've been there, but not for an event. So
no.
It's absolutely beautiful and historic, and been haunted pretty much since it was open. Poltergeist activity, full body apparitions, which actually have been seen on tours before. And actually, I have not seen it. So I've not seen the apparition, but other people have. And proceeds help benefit children's programs at the library. So it's going to be a lot of fun. Tickets for all the events that except for the festival this week and the Paracon in Kansas can be found at paranormalsciencelab.com. So
absolutely. And of course, State of the Ozarks Fest is free to the public. So we just invite you to pile everybody in the car and come on down.
And we want to do a shout out to if you're not listening already, on Branson Podcast Network, you can go over there to bransonpodcastnetwork.com and listen to the podcast. And they have it on SoundCloud as well. So follow Dark Ozarks there. And a shout out to our other sponsor, Beard Engine Brewing Company in Alba, Missouri, which was just named Best Brewery in Missouri for the second year in a row.
Congratulations to the Beard Engine Brewing Company in Alba, Missouri. Alba is a beautiful, beautiful village, and the brewery is fantastic. Alba Press, which is the restaurant, is inside is also fantastic. And not only is the building itself historic and beautiful, but it's also haunted, as is probably the block. There's an enormous amount of history within just a few short 100 yards stretch, and some of it quite violent. It's quite interesting in that regard, and
gangster related, which
leads
us right into our topic.
I know Bonnie and Clyde stopped by for some stamps.
That's right.
That's a euphemism for they robbed the post office.
That's right. Tried to send a postcard.
And depending on where all this was in the time frame, Bonnie might have contemplated mailing some film home, at which point they would not have gone down in infamy.
Yeah, things might have gone differently if she had mailed it off.
Oh, unbelievable. The amount of history that is under our feet, that is just surrounding us constantly, is extraordinary. And if you're listening and watching and you're not in the Ozarks, you're in another location, and you're like, oh my goodness, I just wish I was in the Ozarks where all the cool stuff happened. Thank you But you know what? Incredible, dark, noir history, fascinating history, moving, evocative history of people's lives has all happened where you're at as well. And well worth digging into.
It really is. Now I will say that, our region does seem to have perhaps more than its fair share. I won't deny that. And tonight's topic kind of illustrates that. So
it does. So where do you want to dig in first?
Well, maybe we should kind of start chronologically with this, and we're discussing brushes with gangsters and outlaws in Eureka Springs, which a lot of people don't think about when they think about Eureka Springs, Arkansas. So maybe we should start with the tales of the James boys.
I like that. And of course, just to set the stage a little bit, Eureka Springs is an extraordinary, eccentric, and beautiful location in northwest Arkansas in the Boston Mountains. And it's only about 45 miles, about 50 minutes from where I live in Hollister, Missouri. And it's a beautifully restored Victorian era and Edwardian era town, tucked into between two mountains and the ravine, the valley in between. And lots of quirky history, lots of quirky culture, lots of art, juxtapositions of things that you simply would say, no, those two things don't go together. And yet in Eureka Springs, they do. Mm-hmm. It's considered by many to be a vortex location similar to Sedona.
Yes.
And it's, I think that's not necessarily unfair.
No, I'm not. I don't disagree with that. But I just, I think that has been focused on so much in the last, particularly 20-25 years, that the image people often have is quaint mountain town, just Victorian charm. And there were other aspects that went on. In the midst of all the Victorian charm, you had a lot of nefarious characters wandering about.
You did, and something that's very important to take into consideration with Eureka Springs, Arkansas. It was founded on July 4th, 1879, but the history of white settlement into what became Eureka Springs dates back to at least 1856, possibly earlier. I think realistically earlier. The location was a makeshift hospital and essentially truce zone during the Civil War.
Yes. And to be perfectly honest, I think that's one reason that you ended up with a lot of outlaws going through there, because a lot of those outlaws fought in the Civil War, and so we're familiar with the area from that time period.
It's I think that's very fair. For folks that may be unfamiliar, the Eureka Springs in its initial development, it was marketed as healing springs, healing waters, and as a result, there was a massive influx in population. In a very short period of time from its founding, it had developed a population of over 10,000 people, and then really the sort of new era of development took place with a lot of influx of cash.
Yes.
And a lot of that influx of cash came in the form of individuals associated with reconstruction of Arkansas after the collapse of the Confederacy.
Yes.
And along with that, industry and railroad. And the railroad line was built into Eureka Springs specifically for the purpose of the wealthy having access to tourism in the mountain spa town. And people, I think a lot of people don't necessarily think of the amount of tourism that actually went on during the 19th century. And we see that in Eureka Springs. We see that on Hot Springs. It's obviously outside of Ozarks coverage, but one of my favorite places to go is Biloxi, Mississippi. And people don't realize that Biloxi, Mississippi was a big Gulf of Mexico resort town decades before the Civil War, and primarily because the railroad was built out from New Orleans.
And there's just a number of places like that. Eureka Springs is one of them. But even with all that, as the war was over and you had former soldiers, former bushwhackers, Parson Rangers turn to crime, and often against railroads in vain. They often traveled these routes, and Eureka Springs was no different. There is a legend that goes back a long ways in Eureka Springs and has been in print for a long time, that even before Eureka Springs was a town, that there was a stage stop and tavern on Plainer Hill, and that it was actually run by a distant relative of Jesse and Frank James.
Yes. And that is, to me, that's such an interesting tie-in.
Yeah. And so I haven't found more specific details, but at least that version of the story has been told for a very long time. And so as a result, it would be a place that they would stop that was a safe place to stop. Pretty much the same as safe houses for gangsters during the Depression. So there were stories about the James brothers at the tavern at Plainer Hill, as well as that they would camp at Pivot Rock and use it as a location to ambush people. It's hard. I don't know exactly what the lay of the land and road was around Pivot Rock back then, but I don't know about that one. I haven't decided what I think on that one.
Well, something that I find interesting, and it's part of the nostalgia and the romance of the outlaw, is that, certainly at the time, nobody would necessarily want to be associated with the outlaws, but you give them a generation and everybody's looking for, everybody is an exaggeration, but looking for the connection, because it's suddenly quite romantic and nostalgic and exciting, and to have that, which I mean, to a certain degree, I can appreciate that. Time certainly can do that. And it's certainly from the Alf Bolin story here in Taney in Murder Rocks, it's not unrealistic to have that type of activity. No. And for me, I not knowing exactly where how the rock laid out with the road and everything, whether how feasible it was to be able to really ambush someone behind it. It's hard to know, because it's Pivot Rock because it sits on a very small base.
it's, you think of a triangle with a point on the bottom. So I'm not sure how many men and horses you're going to hide behind it. But
very small horses.
You line them up in a straight line, one behind the other.
It takes a lot of effort.
A lot of coordination. But
nobody sneezes.
Yeah, no one sneezes. But so, and it's definitely possible, I guess. But one of the stories that comes out of the Plainer Hill Tavern and Stage Stop does have more detail, and I find it rather sort of interesting. But again, it fits in the mythology of the James Boys just so perfectly, you have to wonder. And the story, and it's told in the book, the Eureka Springs story, and that basically a very aged man visited Eureka Springs and asked Sam Leith, who was one of the town's guides, to show him the place where the old stage trail and the stop was, 2 or 3 miles south of the city. So they went out there, and the old man tells the story, and he tells the story that it was in the 1870s, and he had resigned his parish in Ozark, Missouri, and to take a church in Pierce City, Missouri. And so he was on the stage going from Ozark, Missouri to Pierce City, and they came through there. And there were several men on the stage with him, and they were held up by 2 bandits. And they were told to get out of the stage, and they robbed the other men, and that one of the bandits pulls him aside and says, are you really a minister? And he says, yes. And says, well, we never steal or take from preachers, widows, or orphans. And then puts some of the money they had just taken from the other stage riders in his pocket. And then they disappear. And so they get back in the stage and ride onto the stage stop. And everyone's quiet. And he remarks that he was surprised that the other passengers didn't seem too upset about being robbed, and that the driver was not surprised. And so he's at the tavern, the inn, that night, and he hears 2 men talking in the room next to him, and he recognizes the voices as the bandits. To me, that's maybe a little bit of a stretch, but anyway, unless they had a very unique voice, I don't know. But anyway, he recognizes their voices and hears them talking, debating about whether or not he really was a minister, and that they are going to test him the next morning. So he thinks and prays on this very long and hard, he says, and then gets up and goes down to breakfast, and sure enough, they're there, and he sits down, and they walk over, and one who he has decided is Frank, puts a gun in his ribs, and Jesse sits across from them, and they basically quiz him the way he had heard they would, and he answers the questions, and they banter, etc., and they end up saying that they believe him, and basically, good luck on your trip, and if you're ever this way again, you have our protection.
And I think there's an interesting undercurrent of the lore, say, surrounding the James Gang, that is not, first of all, there are the obvious comparisons to Robin Hood.
Yes. Thanks to John Edwards, our favorite newspaper man from Lexington, Missouri.
Yes, and certainly there, in both cases, one, dating back to just the lore, and others to the dime novels and the newspaper articles, etc., that took a handful of Western, quote unquote, Western as in west of the Mississippi, Western outlaws and Western lawmen, and created iconic figures out of them. Mm-hmm. That there's something deeply that, so back up for a moment. You can debate the Withertooths and the Whitefors up one side and down the other, and certainly there's a whole almost cottage industry built out of debunking the folklore as opposed to the historical accuracy and that. But I think something that is missed is that the stories that have been either recorded or made up around these characters have a really unique dynamic that is not dissimilar to the Celtic Fae.
Mm-hmm. True.
The turn of wit, the willingness to appeal to personal honor. Essentially, if this civilian in question, sort of the peasant archetypal character, the man unawares, mm-hmm. had responded badly, he could have been shot.
And they certainly would have taken the money back.
Yes. And the willingness to essentially be, for lack of a better term, be a good sport, but have awareness and respect and listen and learn and react appropriately to a difficult situation, react with tact yet strength, with a sense of, with wit and charm and understanding, and a willingness to look into the other world of ambiguity. These are deep archetypal forms.
They are. And then the flip side of that is, in some ways, it makes a lot of sense just practically, because what a lot of people don't realize is that, one, the James boys were highly intelligent, and yes. They were educated.
Yes.
For the time. In fact, Frank James was well versed in Shakespeare and carried a volume of Shakespeare even on robberies, and quoted it all the time. And in this particular instance, I mean, you have the widow stories that go along with the lore, but in this instance, being a minister, there may be some affinity there because their father had been a minister.
Mm-hmm.
And so that may indeed be one reason that they would give him more deference and leeway than they might other people, as long as he was telling the truth,
Right. And I think that there's an element of very rich contextualization and a deep textural quality to these interactions, mm-hmm. that a superficial or a cursory view of the lore misses. That these are very, not just intelligent, but highly complex, not just characters, but people who are deeply interwoven into this particular culture.
Yes. I think you hit it on the head there. I agree with you. I really do. And I do like this story because it's it's a little different than a lot of the Robin Hood, James Boyce stories. So,
Mhm.
and in that way, it does kind of make me wonder that there might be a little truth to it. And there doesn't seem to be a reason the old man would have made it up, and he wasn't seeking profit off of it, you know.
Mhm. It's this in certainly, you know, two of the documented James Gang heists. One of them, the stagecoach heist in Malvern,
Mm-hmm.
and then just a short time later, reportedly the first train that they stopped or
Mm-hmm.
took in near Marble Hill, Missouri, you know, really speaks to the fact that the gang was traversing the hills. They were traversing all over the
Oh,
Ozarks,
yeah.
and
And
and in
outside the Ozarks as well. I mean,
very much all the way to Cordon, Iowa.
and out to Virginia too.
Wow. I forgot about the Virginia one. Cordon, Iowa, just in Wayne County, Iowa, has Jesse James days, simply because Jesse James robbed the bank in Cordon. And for the, you know, the sort of central trans you know, Mississippi theater, you know, 2 counties up into southern Iowa, is a long way north.
It is, but you know, and some people will say, well, they couldn't have really gone to all these places, but you can cover a lot of ground on horseback, and they, you know, they had become very used to that lifestyle during the war, and they continued it.
Yes, yes,
So
they did. I think
it,
it's very. I also think it's interesting where my knee-jerk response to a lot of this is to lean toward the fun and romantic versions of stories anyway.
yeah, I mean, you know, I do too. And then if you can pin it down, it's even better. But it is sort of interesting, particularly through this part of the country, that it reminds me of, you know, people tend to claim, you know, Jesse James was here, you know, sort of the Jesse James slept here. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and it very much is the same as back east with, you know, George Washington slept here, and then also
Yes.
places Abe Lincoln slept.
Yes.
And it's kind of interesting that you have that kind of same kind of following for that fact with Jesse James as you do Washington and Lincoln.
I think so, and certainly some of the more high-minded and idealistic founders of the nation might, you know, looking into the future, be appalled that the, you know, some of the luminaries of America's founding are also, you know, held in the same regard as the outlaws. But I kind of doubt it.
Well, of course, you also have to remember that there were a couple of founding fathers who were privateers as well. So you know, you know,
And I think,
word.
you know, when you also look, and of course you're gonna really dig into some conflicting aspects of the American industrialization of the 19th century in this regard. But much of the founding ideals of the United States were posited by individuals who are willing to put themselves at grave risk from authoritarian structure in order to do what they believed was right. And that's not dissimilar to some of our post-Civil War outlaws.
Very, very much so. And not surprisingly, they had very much the same heritage ancestry.
Yes. Yes. There's certain certain ancestral traits that lean toward individualism, individual freedom, and a whole lot of get up and not back up.
Exactly. Not back down and take care of oneself. So.
Mm-hmm. And one's family.
Yes.
That's just a powerful, powerful aspect. Now, jumping subjects a little bit, straight into Arkansas and Oklahoma's own Bill Doolin.
Yes. And ironically, you know, from the perspective of a lot of the lawmen, Doolin actually was considered the worst, the best of the worst of, you know, outlaws that came out of Oklahoma. Actually, he was an Arkansas boy, born and raised, and then ended up in Kansas and then in Oklahoma, and might have lived out his life working as a farmhand if he hadn't run into the Dalton boys.
Yeah. And for, you know, I think it's interesting, Bill Doolin, the Dalton gang, these are names that have gone down as iconic names in American outlaw history. But just moving back a little bit, who were the Daltons?
Well, the Daltons basically were, you know, they were out of Oklahoma too, and they operated mainly Oklahoma and Kansas. And they actually had come from a rather well-to-do, respected family, much like the James boys and the younger boys. It's sort of ironic. A lot of these folk hero outlaws of that time period, you know, they weren't just your down and out, you know, people from no means. It didn't happen that way. But the Daltons were one of the more successful gangs that came out a little after the James, but they were influenced by Jesse James, and that led to their demise in Coffeyville, because the Daltons wanted to do what Jesse James didn't accomplish, which was to rob two banks at the same time. And of course, when the James gang did it in Northfield, Minnesota, and by the way, Frank James wasn't there. He had left. That's after they'd had the kind of falling out. And that's when the gang really kind of fell apart. And so the Daltons, you know, wanted to basically one up Jesse James, and it just happened that Bill Doolin wasn't there that day.
Mm-hmm.
And there's various versions of why. One was that he was trying to replace his horse and didn't make it there. Emmett Dalton, who was the only Dalton to survive the raid, basically said that his brother had kicked him out for not being mentally stable, but that doesn't really seem to be the case. In fact, if you look at it, Bill Doolin ultimately was probably the most successful outlaw in Oklahoma, and did manage eventually to rob two banks in one day.
It's
the thing got caught.
Good to get those nuts.
who ironically happened to be in the area, filming a movie. He was producing, this is in 1915, was producing a movie about the passing of the Oklahoma Outlaws, and heard that Doolin and his gang were in town, and literally went into town with this film crew trying to get the real shot.
Wow.
And then he shot him in the leg and captured him, and then he later escaped. So.
History imitating art, art imitating life, life imitating history.
Right. But that actually was later. But in Eureka Springs, one of the other guardsmen, I think it was Madsen, had shot him previously in Ingalls, and so Doolin had gone to Eureka Springs to take the waters for arthritis.
Yes. And I think, again, I think that's a, very realistic. It ties in with the tourism base of the town.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And in fact, one statement, they said that Doolin later said that he saw Tillman come in, and he knew him, but he didn't recognize him because he never thought they'd just send one guy.
Oh, love it. Do we know, is there documentation stating which bathhouse?
Yes, it does appear that it was the Basin Spring bathhouse. There are some sources that say the Basin Park, but the Basin Park wasn't built yet.
Right.
When this happened in, I think, 1896. And
right.
So and the Basin Spring bathhouse, there was a fire in the building 40 or 50 years ago, and it's been redone, and there's two businesses in it. The building still exists.
Yes, I've been in that building.
Oh.
It's a beautiful, beautiful structure, and it's an iconic part of downtown.
Yeah, but from what I've seen it referenced, and then other places say the Basin Park, but the Basin Park doesn't make sense. So that's my guess.
Yeah, I think that would be fair. Of course, we're for people who are super sticklers for detail, we're conjecturing right at the moment, just a little bit. But I'm fascinated to do more research on this. And for the where this is apparently leading us, for if you're familiar with downtown Eureka Springs, it is the big bathhouse. It has a number of shops in it at this point, but it's where the walking bridge crosses Mud Street. Yeah. And it's just across from the Basin Spring.
Yes. And so, and realistically, that seems to me make a lot of sense. But yeah, so Doolin was there taking the waters, and ironically, Tillman had disguised himself as a preacher.
Interesting.
And he had spotted him, and then they didn't say, some sort of carpenter or furniture maker. He was having him fashion a box that he could carry his gun in, and then it would do a quick release so the box would drop, because he didn't want to openly carry his gun while he's pretending to be a preacher and alerting Doolin. I'm not sure. how carrying the box wouldn't look odd, but I don't know. And but while that's being done, he sees him again at the bathhouse, and he just goes in and gets him anyway.
Yes. And Tillman is such an interesting story in and of himself.
And we're back.
Yes. A couple of technical issues. Work those through. And but what I was saying was Tillman is such an interesting person, and this entire era, we've reached the point that it's clear that pop culture of the era, say 1915 into the 1920s, recognizes that the Old West is passing. It is deserving of publication, is deserving of history. It's also deserving of notoriety in pop culture in the form of making movies about it. Tillman is a filmmaker at this point, yes, not just a lawman. And yet he is still, this is still what he's doing. He's still participating and contributing to this history, and ultimately ends up getting shot as a lawman.
Yeah, he does in the early 1920s in Cromwell. Basically called in by the governor to clean up the town in a oil field, and ends up getting killed.
Yes. And just the themes of art imitating life imitating art at this liminal space, this threshold between a pre-industrialized or a embryonically industrialized Old West transitioning into a modern industrialized era. To me, it's fascinating, and the Ozarks are right smack dab in the middle of it.
It really is interesting, and I think sort of the transition then is the Henry Starr gang, even though Henry Starr is not there. Sort of their last hurrah is actually robbing the bank of Eureka Springs. And it's kind of interesting because I think 1922, and these are guys who had robbed banks on horses, and now they're robbing using cars. And they had decided they were going to rob the bank at noon, or 5 afternoons, so that people be at lunch. And their watch was off by an hour, and so it's actually 11 when they get there. And ironically, there was a new guy in the gang who basically said, "Are you sure this is a good idea?" Henry Starr and another member, who they both were in jail at that point, had told them Eureka Springs is a death trap. And George Price was running the gang at the time, and he says, "Oh no, it'll be fine." And of course they get caught.
Yes.
And the guy who questioned it ends up going to prison.
It figures.
Yeah. And so, really interesting, and I think that's kind of the transition between the Old West and then the Depression era gangs. And ironically, one of the guys that was there was Arkansas Tom, who his real name was Roy Doherty, but he had been in the Dalton gang.
Yes.
And he ultimately ended up being killed in Joplin in a shootout with the police in about 1924-25. So it's just kind of interesting, you have that motif and these figures. And another interesting item on Tillman, I read somewhere he tended to carry a volume of Shakespeare with him.
Somehow that's not terribly surprising.
No. And so, it just made me think maybe he and Frank James had a little bit in common. But
I think that's fair. In regards to Eureka Springs being a death trap for the bank robbery, I'm assuming that it was in part because of the hills and the difficulty of getting out, but I don't know.
That would be my guess, is that, you know, Henry Starr was saying you don't want to try to rob something in Eureka Springs because you're not going to get out of there before they catch you.
Yeah,
it's just the way I took it. Yeah, and
certainly different than some of the wide open spaces that you could make a run for it.
Exactly, and if that's what he was meaning, he was right. Right.
Oh, not inaccurate. It's there's just, to me, and of course, not necessarily aiding in a getaway from Eureka Springs, but an aspect of of that demographic coming to Eureka Springs is it was not far from Indian territory.
That's right. And of course, you know, but by that point, you know, it wasn't Indian territory anymore, it was Oklahoma. And, right, you know, they had really cracked down. And, you know, sort of an interesting point about Henry Starr was, you know, he was distantly related to Sam Starr, who was married to Belle Starr, but he had been sentenced to death twice by Isaac Parker, the hanging judge in Fort Smith, and actually helped stop a prison break. And so they had shortened his sentence, and he actually was pardoned by Teddy Roosevelt, and then he couldn't stay on the straight and narrow, and ended up robbing Bates in Oklahoma again, and got caught at Stroud, and that's why he wasn't with the gang in Eureka Springs.
Wow, just the interlocking processes that seemingly tie all of this together, to me, is fascinating.
It really is to me as well. So I think maybe one takeaway is that of all places in the Ozarks that you don't associate with gangsters and outlaws, you know, maybe gambling and drinking, that kind of thing, but not, you know, not Old West outlaws and Depression era gangsters is Eureka Springs, and but that's not necessarily the case.
It's not, and you know, some of aspects of that history, and then transitioning into gangster history in association with some very big names.
Lose you? Are you there?
Yes.
Okay. It cut out for a second.
Yeah, did on my side as well.
Okay. You might just repeat that last sentence.
Just there's, you know, the history of essentially outlaw turned gangster history really continued into mid-century in the Ozarks, as well as specifically in Eureka Springs, and Joplin is not excluded from that as well.
Very true, very true. And actually, one of the more infamous events in this part of the country in that time period, the Kansas City Massacre, has some connection to Eureka Springs, because the massacre happened because, well, depending on the version, either Vern Miller and Ricchetti and Pretty Boy Floyd were trying to either kill Joey Nash so he couldn't talk, or were trying to rescue him from the U.S. Marshals as they were bringing him up And there's a story that at one point, he was hiding out in Eureka Springs for a while, trying to evade them. And as he's traveling through the Arkansas Ozarks, he ends up being arrested, and then ultimately taken up to Kansas City, where everything goes bad for everybody, pretty much.
Right.
And by some accounts, even Al Capone got involved in the aftermath. So, because Vern Miller, who's also a fascinating character, because he started out as a actually even before World War I, in the Army, and then serving in World War I, becoming a lawman in South Dakota, actually founding the American Legion in the area that he was lawman, but became known to be very quick on the trigger. And then he and his wife left for a vacation, never came back, and then they found out he'd been embezzling money. And then he hooked up with the mafia in New York, and then he ends up basically working with Pretty Boy Floyd and Jelly Nash, and it's reputed that he was instrumental in the massacre, along with Harry Bailey, who was known as the Dean of American Bank Robbers, who was from Joplin and lived in Joplin, and worked with Harold Farmer, who had the largest safe house in the Midwest here in Joplin. And stories went that shortly after the massacre, that Miller was basically hauled into Chicago by Al Capone and trying to figure out what the hell happened, and that they were after Pretty Boy Floyd and him, and that they were trying to put a lid on it because the massacre was basically putting everyone in danger, and it ultimately led to the FBI gaining a lot more law enforcement power.
Right. And the case of Vern Miller, there's a couple of things that was really striking to me about the Vern Miller situation. One, of course, is from Iowa, and that's where my family's from.
Yeah, originally,
so this is some personal aspects of that, but
as was Peck Thomas, who was one of the deputies with Tillman bringing in Doolin.
Yes, so lots of cultural and geographical connections there, obviously. A big part of Vern Miller's story that stood out to me was that allegedly his first embezzlement case took place because his wife had fallen ill and he was trying to pay her medical bills.
Yeah.
And I found that tragic, really, in the sense, and at the time that it took place, he was a lawman.
Yeah. And fairly respected.
Yes. And then getting convicted for embezzlement, and basically it upending his life in this regard. He ends up
I was interested in his practicality, because he had a lot of community leaders who offered to pay his bond to let him out, which was $10,000, but it was cheaper to take the convention.
Oh, very fair. It's that that to me, that, and of course he ends up splitting with his wife, and his new girlfriend seems to be rather enthusiastic about a life of crime.
Yeah. At least for a while.
Yes. And then at the in essence, at the end of things, that he is essentially acting as a hired gun.
Yeah.
And he's living as a hired gun. He ultimately dies as a hired gun. There's, some compelling allegations that he's killed because he's a liability.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And potentially killed by people that he was working for, or in that regard.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, this is, I've watched my share of machine gun gangster movies from this era, and etc. And certainly you have your protagonist, you have your antagonist, and then around the bad guy you have a handful of hired guns.
Mm-hmm.
And they, for the way that the script is written, these guys, they're there to look tough, they're there to kill somebody, but that's as far as the script goes. What is very interesting to me with the Vern Miller story is his biography tells the rest of that story of how he got to the point of acting in that capacity, to being hired in that capacity. And to me, that is both tragic and fascinating.
It really is, because I mean, and he goes through such a metamorphosis, so to speak. Kind of reminds me of the Charlie Barter story, who was grandson and son of some of the Staffelback murderers, and
yes,
becomes war hero, and then a policeman, and then basically ends up having mental problems and committed suicide by cop.
Yes.
There was a very similar trajectory between he and Vern Miller, and except for that Charlie did not ultimately work with the mafia.
Right. And it's just the cautionary tale, I suppose, or the aspect that the line between hero and villain, as remembered by history, can just be a handful of small events.
Yes, a handful of small decisions too, in several places that it could have gone a different direction, it looked like.
It does. And it looks like his wife Mildred, his first wife Mildred's illness in 1922 proved the catalyst.
Yeah, it very much looks like if that hadn't happened, none of the resulting crimes, etc., may have happened.
Yes. There's again, and it brings to mind, of course, for me, accounts of, for example, war heroes, etc., who are who's suffering through accolades and say things to the line of, I don't deserve it, or I don't want to talk about it.
Right. Exactly.
And the idea, and of course, I'm all for honoring our veterans and honoring the past services of our men and women in all of these capacities, and remembering what they've done is just, to me, fascinating, because certainly the actions, I suppose, devoid of the contextualization. But if you're in the war, if you're in the line of duty, and it involves not just arrest, but quite frankly, killing people, and then you come home and they're going, yeah, you're a hero, but then change the contextualization. You embezzled $6,000 to pay for your wife, and now you're a villain.
Well, and flip that back around to where we started. That's pretty well the story for the James boys and a lot of people coming out of the Civil War, whether we
Yeah.
want to admit it or not.
Mm-hmm. And I think that especially with the James Gang, the fact that their their civilian targets were in their minds military targets.
Often, yes, because they
And,
equated them with their enemy. Yeah.
and the Union became synonymous with industrialization
Mm-hmm.
and economic progress in the form of the banks.
Yes.
And union banks in particular, union bank companies
And railroads.
and railroads. And it's that there was a short period of time, particularly in Missouri history, that Missouri was almost exclusively agrarian.
Mm-hmm.
Few railroads. You had the romantic and often deadly riverboat transit,
Yes.
and and beyond that, to such a large degree, it was either a slow wagon or a fast horse.
Pretty much.
And I can't help but think, for many of the people who vicariously experienced a sense of pride or a sense of protection with the actions of the James Gang and others, it was a sense that everything that they knew about their lives was being forced to change.
Exactly. With absolutely no control over it.
No. And that, obviously the majority of the population did not become James gangs,
right?
But they could cheer, sometimes very quietly,
mm-hmm.
for the individuals that did stand up.
Exactly. And it's and we've mentioned this before, it's easy to say, oh, you shouldn't talk about these things, or you shouldn't, you're glamorizing these things, horror, crime or whatever. And that's not really the case. You have to understand the context it all happened in, and how it was viewed at the time and why.
Yes.
I think, although to be honest, I think a lot of people take that view because they don't want to admit there could be circumstances that they may be cheering someone on.
Agreed. And it's also I think the myopic approach to choose not to contextualize our history properly.
True. I agree. And unfortunately, since history tends to be taught as a survey, and very superficially, I think as it almost becomes a knee-jerk reaction to view everything in history that way.
I agree. It's difficult to, especially if you approach history as something that's boring, it's difficult to really dig into the contextualization and the nuance and the emotion that goes into the decisions, why certain things happen. And the fact that there are aspects, in some cases economic aspects,
mm-hmm.
In some cases infrastructure aspects, that the Ozarks in particular are still responding to from the Civil War.
Mm-hmm. We don't like to admit that, but it's the truth.
Yeah, the idea that that's supposed to have been so long ago, it would no longer have any impact upon today.
That's just our our present instant experience society that if it hasn't happened in the last 5 minutes, it doesn't exist.
Oh, I know. And the ideas we referenced Shakespeare, the fact that Shakespeare's works were impacting these men in the 19th century. They continue to impact in the 20th century, and I think they'll continue. Shakespeare's words will continue to resonate and impact individuals far into the future. These were words that were written down in the early 1600s during James the First. I mean, sixth. I mean, both.
Both, technically. No, very, very much the case. And it's just that fact when you think about it is humbling.
It is. And I think part of what keeps us from wanting to think along those lines is that there's a threat that what we do may be resonating down through the generations, and we don't like that idea. We want our actions to be, first of all, we want everyone to be able to contextualize our decisions right now.
Yeah.
But second of all, I don't think that we want to deal with the weight that the decisions that we make are impacting not just the next generation, but perhaps multiple generations, hundreds of years into the future.
Very true. And, generational guilt is a horrible thing, I guess.
Especially when, applied to oneself and then projected forward into an unknown future. That's worth at least 6 existential crises right there.
That's right. We don't need to bring Nietzsche into this, though.
Oh my gosh. When don't we need to bring Nietzsche into this?
Okay, fair statement.
I embrace my nihilism with espresso.
Yeah.
How much nihilism do I have? How much coffee do you want?
Oh, I embrace nihilism with whatever form of caffeine is at hand. So
yes, caffeine or alcohol, either one. Sometimes both at the same time. It's a good combination.
True.
Oh my gosh, that might be a good place to wrap things up.
Yeah, we've devolved to nihilism, so that might be a good spot.
It's a cheerful nihilism. It's okay.
That's true. We appreciate everybody, and we'll be back next week. And check out the events coming up, and we'd love to see y'all. So
absolutely,
and we just really appreciate the support everyone's giving.
Yes, we do. And of course, thank you, Lisa, and thank you to our producer, Alex.
Thanks, Josh, and thanks, everyone, and thanks, Alex.